In a web of lies and shadows, one detective must face the cost of uncovering the truth. The hospital was eerily quiet, save for the soft beep of machines. A newborn lay in the bassinet, swaddled tightly in a white blanket. Only hours earlier, she had been declared healthy by the doctors. A small, perfect girl with wide eyes, her cries echoing softly through the sterile halls. But now, something felt wrong. The room felt colder, even though the air conditioner hummed in the corner. Detective Lara stood at the door, her eyes scanning the room. A nurse had found the baby moments earlier, lifeless. There had been no sign of trauma, no obvious explanation. Lara's heart raced, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She had seen many things in her career, but this was different. This felt deliberate. She stepped closer to the bassinet, her shoes clicking softly on the tile floor. The baby's face was pale, the skin almost translucent in the dim light. A small drop of blood stained the white blanket. Lara's mind raced. She had been told the baby was healthy. No complications. How could this be? A low murmur came from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Ashford standing in the doorway, his face grim. "I didn't think." He started, trailing off. His words hung in the air. Lara's eyes narrowed. "Think what?" she asked, her voice sharp. The doctor swallowed, stepping further into the room. "I didn't think anyone could get to her. Not in here." Lara stared at him. His hands were shaking slightly. "What do you mean, doctor?" she pressed. Ashford hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Someone wanted her dead. They had to have been in the room." Lara's heart skipped a beat. The doors had been locked. The only other person in the room was the nurse, who had been checked out and verified. A soft rustle broke the silence. Lara looked down. The baby's tiny hand twitched. Impossible. The pulse was gone. But the hand moved. Slowly. Lara's breath caught. Her gaze shot to the bloodstain. The tiny drop had spread. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. A glint of silver caught her eye. There, beneath the blanket. A small needle. It had been used recently. Too recently. Lara's pulse quickened. This wasn't an accident. It was murder. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. But who would do such a thing? And why? The door opened behind her. She turned, instinctively reaching for her gun. But it wasn't the nurse. It was the head of security, his face pale and sweating. "Detective, you need to see this," he said, his voice trembling. Lara followed him down the corridor, her mind racing. She could already feel the weight of the case settling on her shoulders. It was just the beginning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they walked down the narrow hallway. Lara's footsteps echoed, sharp and steady, but her mind was elsewhere. Each breath she took felt heavier. The security officer led her to a small office, its door cracked open. Inside, a monitor displayed footage from the hospital's security cameras. Lara stepped inside, her eyes glued to the screen. At first, it was just a blur of motion. Then, a figure appeared. A tall silhouette in scrubs, moving swiftly down the hallway toward the maternity ward. The timestamp on the bottom right corner read 3:23 a.m. Lara's eyes narrowed. The figure seemed familiar. She leaned closer to the screen, studying the movements. Something about the way the person moved. It was almost too deliberate. Too practiced. The figure paused outside the maternity ward door, glancing over their shoulder. Then, with a swift motion, they slipped inside. Lara's pulse quickened. She recognized the person now. It was Dr. Ashford. The doctor who had been standing in the room when the baby was discovered dead. The realization hit Lara with the force of a punch. She turned to the security officer. "Run the footage back," she demanded. The officer complied, rewinding the clip to just before Ashford entered the room. Lara's eyes scanned the screen, then froze. A figure had followed Ashford. A second person, cloaked in shadow, moving just as quietly. "Who is that?" Lara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officer squinted at the screen, trying to make out the blurry face. "It looks like a nurse," he said uncertainly. But Lara's gut told her otherwise. The nurse had been the first to discover the body, too. "Can you enhance the image?" she asked. The officer clicked a few buttons, and the screen zoomed in. The blurry figure came into focus. Lara's heart skipped a beat. It was no nurse. It was Sarah, the newborn's mother. The woman who had seemed so distraught earlier. But why? Why would she? "Play the rest of the footage," Lara said, her voice cold. The officer complied again, and they watched as Sarah, face twisted in agony, stepped over the threshold of the baby's room. She didn't seem frantic. Instead, she looked almost relieved. Her hands shook as she approached the bassinet. She leaned in, whispering something that couldn't be heard. Then, she did something that made Lara's blood run cold. She held a syringe, hidden in her palm. A familiar silver glint reflected off the screen. Without hesitation, Sarah injected the needle into the baby's tiny arm. Lara felt a knot tighten in her chest. Her voice trembled when she spoke. She killed her own child. But why? It didn't make sense. The mother had seemed devastated. Desperate. But there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Suddenly, the room seemed stifling. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of the truth. Lara stepped back, unable to tear her eyes from the screen. The footage continued to play. Sarah, after administering the lethal dose, stood motionless for a long moment. Then, she gently kissed the baby's forehead, as if asking for forgiveness. Her eyes were vacant. Empty. It was the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. The tragedy wasn't just about a lost child. It was about a mother who had been pushed too far. A woman who had snapped, overwhelmed by guilt and a twisted sense of justice. Lara's breath caught in her throat. The case had taken a dark turn, and the answers she sought only led to more questions. But one thing was certain now. The hospital had kept its secrets well. And the twisted truth of this murder would haunt everyone involved forever. Lara stood frozen, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of what had just been uncovered. The images on the screen flickered, but her focus never wavered. Sarah's face, pale and empty, haunted her thoughts. Why? Why would a mother do this to her own child? The silence in the room pressed down on her, suffocating, as the security footage continued to loop. Her thoughts raced. A mother's love was supposed to be unconditional. But what if that love had been warped by something darker? Was it guilt? Regret? Or was it something more sinister, lurking beneath the surface? Lara turned sharply to the security officer. "Where is she now?" The officer swallowed, his face pale as he checked the system. "She's been moved to another room," he said, his voice tight. "Get me to her. Now." Lara's voice was steely, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. They moved quickly down the halls, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Lara's thoughts were a whirlwind, but one question stood out above all: what had driven Sarah to kill her child? They reached a sterile, white room at the end of the corridor. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were vacant, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't react when Lara stepped inside. Lara stood in the doorway for a moment, studying the woman in front of her. The woman who had given birth to a child just hours ago. The woman who had murdered her. Lara took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "Sarah," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The woman blinked, as though startled from a trance. Her eyes shifted slowly toward Lara, but there was no recognition in them. "Why?" Lara asked, her voice catching in her throat. "Why did you do it?" For a long time, Sarah didn't answer. She simply stared at the detective, her lips trembling. Then, in a barely audible voice, she spoke. It was the only way, to stop the pain. Laura frowned, leaning forward slightly. What pain? Sarah's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe. Then, with a shaky breath, she finally spoke. The voices. They told me it was the only way. They told me she would never be normal. That she would suffer forever, and that I had to do it. I didn't want to, but I had to. Lara's stomach churned. The woman's words were tangled in delusion, in a madness that gripped her mind. What voices, Sarah? Lara asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Sarah's lips trembled again, and she whispered, almost to herself, they've been with me, since the miscarriage. Since the first baby. I thought they were gone, but they never left. The truth hit Lara like a freight train. This wasn't just a mother's guilt. It wasn't just a tragic, isolated act of violence. Sarah had been suffering from something far more insidious, psychosis, perhaps, or some form of postpartum disorder. And somewhere along the way, in the dark corners of her mind, the voices had taken control. Lara took a step closer, her heart aching for the woman before her. It wasn't about evil. It was about a mind unraveling, slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the madness. Sarah, Lara said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. You need help. You need to get better. But the woman didn't respond. Her eyes were already distant again, lost in a world only she could see. Lara stood there for a long moment, the weight of the case settling in her bones. She had thought this was about justice. But it wasn't. It was about understanding. And it was about the tragedy of a mother who had lost herself completely. In the end, there was no simple answer. No neat conclusion. Just the haunting realization that some wounds run deeper than anyone can imagine. Lara stood there, her heart heavy, as Sarah's vacant stare locked onto something far beyond her reach. The silence in the room felt suffocating now, almost like a presence of its own. Lara's eyes lingered on the woman who had, moments ago, been a mother. But now, she was something else, lost, broken, disconnected from reality. The voices, Sarah had said. Lara didn't need to be a psychologist to understand that they weren't just figments of Sarah's imagination. They were the cruel whispers of a fractured mind, dragging her into a place where even the love for her own child was twisted beyond recognition. Lara slowly turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. There was nothing more to be done here, not today. Not with Sarah, who had already slipped away from this world and into another. The case had taken a turn so dark that it felt as though there would be no coming back. Outside the room, the air felt colder. She needed answers, real answers, not the ones wrapped in delusion. And the only place left to find those was in the hospital's deeper, hidden corners. Lara's mind raced as she made her way back to the maternity ward, the pieces of the puzzle falling together in disjointed fragments. Had Sarah acted alone? Had someone more sinister, played a role in pushing her over the edge? Her gut told her there was more to this story. The whispers in the dark, the people who had seen Sarah's increasingly erratic behavior, the strange, out-of-place conversations she'd had with some of the nurses. Something was off. Something had been orchestrated. She would find it. She had to. In the maternity ward, the place where it had all started, Lara was greeted by the head nurse, Karen. She wasn't as composed as usual. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice shaky as she greeted Lara. "Detective, do you have any new information?" Karen asked. Lara studied her carefully, noting the subtle nervousness in the nurse's demeanor. Her mind shifted gears, her instincts on high alert. "I need to talk to you, Karen," Lara said, her tone quiet but commanding. The nurse nodded and led her to a small office down the hallway. The air in the room was thick with tension. Lara took a seat, watching Karen closely. "Tell me everything you know about Sarah," Lara began, her voice steady. Karen hesitated for a moment, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "Sarah, she wasn't the same after the miscarriage," the nurse started slowly. She came to the hospital with her husband, and she was different. Distressed, yes. But there was something more, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She started talking about the baby like it was already broken. Laura listened intently, leaning forward. Go on. Karen bit her lip. She started asking strange questions, Detective. About illnesses, about deformities. About what happens if the child isn't perfect. It wasn't just normal pregnancy nerves. She was obsessed, almost as if she was terrified of something happening. Lara's thoughts churned. She could feel the pieces coming together, but they still didn't form a full picture. And after the baby was born? Laura pressed. Karen's voice dropped lower, her face pale. After the birth. Sarah seemed distant. Cold. Her eyes, they were empty. She didn't seem to care about the baby the way a mother should. I thought maybe it was postpartum depression, but there was something else. Something off. She wouldn't let anyone else near the baby. She kept saying she had to protect her from the world. From everyone. Laura felt a chill creep down her spine. It wasn't just Sarah who had been consumed by fear. It was a fear passed down from somewhere else, an unspoken, hidden force that had latched onto Sarah, pulling her further into the darkness. Did she say anything else? Anything that might explain what happened? Lara's voice was quiet but insistent. Karen paused, her face contorting with confusion. She said she had to end it. To save the baby from the world that would destroy her. She was convinced the child would suffer forever. Lara's mind reeled. A mother's desperate act of mercy? Or had Sarah's mind simply snapped under the pressure of her own fears? The twisted version of reality Sarah had created, where her child would suffer if left alive, began to take shape. But there was still something Laura couldn't shake. The darkness that seemed to linger in the shadows, pulling at Sarah's fragile mind. Who had fed those thoughts to her? Who had convinced her that her baby's death was the only option? The answer was closer than Laura realized. But she wasn't quite ready to confront it yet. Not until she could piece together every last detail. There was a bigger game at play here. And Laura was determined to expose it. Lara's thoughts swirled like a storm, each one tugging her in a different direction. The deeper she dug, the more questions surfaced. She had always trusted her instincts, and now they screamed at her. Something wasn't right. Karen's nervousness, Sarah's fractured mind, the whispers about the baby, all of it felt too orchestrated, too well-timed. Laura stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "Thank you, Karen," she said, her voice sharp with purpose. The nurse nodded, her eyes filled with confusion, but Laura was already halfway out the door. There was more to this story, she could feel it in her bones. She wasn't going to let this go. The hospital had been hiding something, and Laura wasn't going to leave until she found it. She stormed down the sterile hallway, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her mind flickered back to the footage she had seen earlier. The syringe. The needle. The blood. Everything pointed to Sarah, asterisk or so it seemed star. But there was one detail that kept nagging at Laura, one thread she couldn't shake. What if Sarah wasn't the only one who had been manipulated? What if someone had planted the idea in her mind? Laura needed to see the records. She needed to get her hands on anything that could tell her who else might have been involved. She made her way to the hospital's administration wing, her thoughts racing with every step. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, as if everyone knew not to make a sound when a detective came through. At the front desk, a receptionist looked up, startled. Laura didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need access to Sarah's medical files," she said, her voice commanding. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. I am sorry, detective, but that's highly confidential. I can't." Laura cut her off, leaning over the counter. "Get me the files, now." The receptionist blinked, then nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she pulled up the necessary documents. Lara scanned them quickly, her eyes darting over the pages. Everything seemed normal at first glance, standard postnatal care, routine checkups. But something caught her eye. A note from Dr. Ashford. It was brief, almost too brief. Patient shows signs of psychological distress. May need further evaluation. Lara's blood ran cold. It was a warning, a red flag, buried deep within the paperwork. But there was something even more alarming in the notes. In one of the later entries, written just days before the baby's death, Dr. Ashford had recommended a consultation with a psychiatrist. Lara's instincts flared. She knew something wasn't right about Ashford, but this was the confirmation she needed. She turned to leave, but a voice stopped her. "Detective Lara," said a deep, calm voice behind her. She spun around, her hand instinctively moving toward her sidearm. Standing there was Dr. Ashford, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Then, he spoke again, his tone low. "I was wondering when you'd come for me." Lara's pulse quickened. "Why did you do it, Ashford?" she demanded. He smiled faintly, the edges of his lips curling in a way that made Lara's skin crawl. "Do what, detective? You think I made her do something?" Lara didn't flinch. "Yes, I do. You were the one who pushed her toward the edge. You put those thoughts in her head." Ashford stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Lara's heart raced. "I know enough," she shot back. "Sarah wasn't the only one I was trying to help," Ashford continued, his voice suddenly tinged with a dark undercurrent. "She wasn't the first to break. You think this is just about her? It's bigger than that." Lara froze, confusion swirling in her mind. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Ashford's eyes gleamed, and for a second, Lara thought she saw something that wasn't human, a flash of malice, a hunger. "This isn't the first time I've dealt with a mother who needed release," he said softly, the words like poison. "I've been helping people like Sarah for years. It's not just about the child. It's about saving the mother." Lara's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure she fully understood what he meant, but she knew one thing for certain: this man was not just a doctor. He was a predator. Ashford took a step back, his face transforming into something more controlled, almost friendly. "You don't understand, detective. But you will. Soon." Lara didn't wait another second. With a swift motion, she grabbed her phone and dialed for backup, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't going to let him walk away. Not after everything she had uncovered. Not after the damage he had done. Ashford's smile never left his face. But Lara could see the cracks in it now. And she knew, this asterisk was the moment the twisted truth was finally unraveling. Lara's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving Dr. Ashford. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not with him standing there, his cold, calculating smile still stretched across his face. "Detective Lara, you really think you can stop me?" Ashford's voice was almost amused, as if they were playing a game. Lara's jaw tightened. "I'm not playing any games, Ashford," she said through gritted teeth. "You're under arrest for the murder of a child and conspiracy to cause harm. And I know you're involved in much more than that." His smile faltered for the briefest second, but he quickly regained his composure. "Conspiracy? Murder?" Ashford's voice was slow, deliberate. "You're a bit out of your depth here, detective. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Lara felt a chill creep up her spine. There was something about the way he spoke, like he knew something she didn't, like he had already won. But she wasn't backing down. "Tell me everything," Lara demanded, her voice hard. Ashford chuckled softly. "I don't think you're ready for the truth, Lara," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You see, this hospital, this city, they're all just pieces in a much bigger picture. I've been part of something for years, something far more powerful than you could ever imagine." Lara's mind raced. What was he talking about? What could be bigger than a hospital full of patients and doctors? Suddenly, the door behind them slammed open, and Lara turned, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. A uniformed officer rushed in, followed by a team of detectives. "Lara, we've got the arrest warrant," the officer said, breathless. Lara didn't hesitate. "Take him," she ordered. Two officers moved forward, their hands reaching for Ashford's arms, but he stepped back, a grin tugging at his lips. "Don't you see, detective," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "You've already lost. You think you can just arrest me and that's the end of it? No. You've walked into something much darker than you realize. And you're too far gone to turn back now." The officers froze for a moment, uncertainty in their eyes. Lara's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? Before she could respond, the building suddenly felt different, like something was shifting in the air. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen, her blood running cold. It was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, it's not over. This is just the beginning. Asterisk. Lara's mind spun. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. The team had only just begun to close in on Ashford, but now something was off. Something beyond the walls of the hospital, beyond Ashford's manipulation. The message was a warning, but from who? A cold knot twisted in her stomach. Was this part of Ashford's plan? "Get him out of here," Lara snapped to the officers, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. As they moved to take Ashford away, his eyes locked onto hers one last time, his grin widening. "You're walking right into it, detective," he said softly. "You'll regret it." Lara turned away, her pulse quickening. But as she followed the officers down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous was looming over her, over everything. Her phone buzzed again, the same number. This time, the message was even more cryptic. Asterisk, you're on the wrong side of this. You have no idea who's really in charge. Asterisk. Lara clenched her jaw. Who was behind this? What was Ashford involved in, and why did he seem so certain that she couldn't stop it? She needed to dig deeper. This case wasn't just about one man and one twisted act. It was about a network. A conspiracy. A hidden power that had manipulated everyone involved. And Lara was going to uncover it, no matter where it took her. The hospital, the staff, the patients, all of them were just pieces of a much larger game. And the true mastermind was still out there. Lara's grip tightened on her phone, her mind already working through the next steps. She was going to find the truth, no matter what it took. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper she went, the more she was entangled in something much darker than she had ever imagined. And soon, it might be too late to get out. Lara's pulse raced as she stepped into the elevator, the cold metal doors sliding shut behind her. Her thoughts swirled, each one more disturbing than the last. The cryptic messages. Ashford's warnings. Something wasn't right, and it was getting worse by the minute. The elevator descended, its hum echoing in the otherwise silent building. Lara's fingers tightened around her phone. She glanced at the screen again, still the same unknown number. The message now seemed almost mocking. Asterisk, they'll come for you soon. They always do. Asterisk. Her stomach twisted. Who were they? Who was really pulling the strings? The elevator dinged, signaling her arrival at the ground floor. Lara stepped out, her mind sharp, her senses heightened. She wasn't alone in the lobby. A few officers moved about, filing reports and discussing the next steps of the investigation. But one of them caught her eye. Detective Harris, an older man with a weathered face, stood off to the side, his gaze steady but distant. Lara knew him well. He had always been reliable, until now. He approached her, his footsteps deliberate. "Lara," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk to you." Something in his tone made Lara pause. It wasn't just routine. There was an urgency there. "What's going on, Harris?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. He glanced around before lowering his voice even further. I've been going through some files, and I found something I think you need to see. Lara's brow furrowed. What kind of files? Harris hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. Not just the medical files. Something bigger. Something that connects Ashford to more than just Sarah. He's been involved in something for years, detective. Something that's far-reaching. Lara's pulse quickened. Show me, she said, her voice firm. He led her to a back office, a small room tucked away from the rest of the busy precinct. The door clicked shut behind them. Harris pulled out a folder, thick with papers, and slid it across the desk to her. Lara's eyes scanned the first few pages. It was a list of names. Names that weren't just hospital staff, these were people from different industries, all connected somehow to Ashford. But what caught her attention were the notes scribbled in the margins. Asterisk influence in the highest circles. Asterisk. Asterisk control over local law enforcement. Asterisk. Lara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a twisted doctor. This was someone who had been manipulating people for years. Harris leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashford didn't just act alone, Lara. He's part of something much bigger. A network. A web of power that extends into law enforcement, politics, even the media. These people, they've been controlling things behind the scenes. And now they've set their sights on you. Lara's mind raced as she processed the information. She thought back to the cryptic messages, the way Ashford had spoken with such certainty. The pieces were starting to fit together. But the implications were staggering. She wasn't just chasing a killer anymore. She was up against an entire system. A conspiracy that had been decades in the making. Lara looked up at Harris, her eyes hardening. You're telling me this is all connected? That Ashford isn't the end of this, but the beginning? Harris nodded grimly. You're already in too deep, Lara. If you keep going down this road, they won't just threaten you. They'll destroy you. A cold wave of realization washed over Lara. This wasn't just about a single murder. It wasn't even about the people involved directly, it was about something much darker. A power structure that had infiltrated every layer of society. Lara's hands shook, but only for a second. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. She glanced at the files again, then back at Harris. Who else knows about this? She asked, her voice low but fierce. Harris looked away, his jaw clenched. I'm not the only one who's seen it, he said finally. But I'm the only one who's still alive to talk about it. Lara's stomach churned. Harris's words hung in the air, thick with a deadly warning. What are you saying, Harris? He looked her dead in the eye. Lara, they've been watching us. Watching you. And now, it's only a matter of time before they make their move. Lara felt a chill creep down her spine. They were watching her. Who exactly was they? Suddenly, a loud noise from outside the office startled her. The distinct sound of a gunshot. Her heart skipped. Harris's face paled. You've come this far, detective, his voice continued, smooth as ever. But you're still missing the bigger picture. Her breath quickened. Where am I? She demanded, her voice hoarse. What's going on? What do you want from me? Ashford's laughter echoed in the darkness. It wasn't just his voice, it was his laugh, but twisted, hollow, like a puppet on strings. You've already made the hardest choice, Lara. You've stepped into the darkness, but you haven't realized it yet. She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. Tell me, she said, almost pleading. Tell me what the hell is going on. Another laugh. A cruel, mocking laugh that sent a shiver down her spine. Oh, I'll tell you soon enough. But first, you need to understand. This was always going to happen. You've been a part of it from the very beginning. A light flickered on, blinding her for a moment, and when her vision cleared, she saw him standing there, Ashford. But not like she had seen him before. This was a different Ashford, one whose eyes gleamed with an unsettling hunger. And behind him, a wall of monitors. Endless screens, flickering with images of people she knew. People she had trusted. People who had been part of his web. And there, on one of the screens, was her face. Her every move, her every decision, was being watched. Lara took a step back, her mind racing. She was just another piece in their game. And now, there was no way out. Lara stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The monitors flickered in front of her, showing faces she recognized, some familiar, some chillingly new. Each screen was like a window into a different life, a different story, a story that had been manipulated from the shadows. And there, front and center, was her own face. Her every move, every decision, displayed for the world to see. Ashford watched her with cold, calculated eyes, his lips curling into a smile that sent a wave of disgust washing over her. "You've always been the pawn, Lara," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But tonight, you've finally made it to the game." Her pulse raced, but she refused to let fear control her. She had to think. Had to act. This wasn't just about Ashford. It was never just about him, "I don't care about your game, Ashford," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm done being a piece on your board." Ashford's smile widened, as if amused by her defiance. "Is that so? You really think you can walk away now? You've been part of this for too long. We've been watching you, Lara. Every step. Every move. You're as much a part of this as any of them." Lara's chest tightened, but she refused to let the words sink in. She needed to focus. There had to be a way out. A way to turn the tables. "You think I'm afraid of you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Ashford laughed softly, stepping closer to the row of monitors. "I don't think you're afraid, Lara. I think you're just realizing how deep you are in it. This, all of this has been a part of the plan for years. Your investigation? It was never just about the murder. You've been chasing ghosts, chasing shadows, while we've been controlling the pieces." Lara's stomach churned. "You've been playing with lives," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists. Ashford's eyes glinted with dark amusement. Your life, especially," he said. "You're the final piece, Lara. The one that completes everything." Lara's mind raced. She had to move. Without thinking, she lunged forward, slamming her fist into the nearest monitor. The screen shattered, sending a sharp crack echoing through the warehouse. For a moment, Ashford stood there, unmoving, watching her. "You think breaking a few screens will change anything?" he said, his voice quiet but cold. "It's too late for you. You're already part of the system." Lara's hand still burned from the impact. But she wasn't done. "I'm not part of your system," she spat, "and I'm not going to be your pawn." She turned quickly, her eyes darting around the room. There had to be something, anything, that could turn the tide in her favor. Then, her gaze landed on the control panel. Ashford had been focused on her, but his attention had shifted just enough for her to see it. The panel was covered in buttons, levers, and switches. One of them had to be the key. Lara moved swiftly, her feet barely making a sound as she crossed the room. She reached the panel and slammed her palm onto the nearest lever. The lights above her flickered once, then cut off completely, plunging the room into darkness. Ashford cursed under his breath, his voice filled with fury. "You think you've won?" he called out into the blackness. "You think this changes anything?" Lara could barely make out his figure in the dark, but she didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbing a metal pipe from the ground and swinging it with all her strength. The pipe connected with something solid, and Ashford's voice suddenly stopped. Lara stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for the next move. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the darkness. Her eyes narrowed, heart pounding, waiting for the next attack. But nothing came. Lara's grip tightened around the pipe. She had one chance. The footsteps grew closer. And in that moment, she made her move. She swung the pipe once more, this time harder, directly toward where she thought Ashford's head would be. A grunt. Then, the sound of someone, collapsing to the ground. Lara stood still for a moment, listening. It was quiet. Too quiet. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone, and fumbled to turn on the flashlight. As the dim light flickered to life, she scanned the room. Ashford was lying on the floor, blood pooling around his head, his eyes lifeless. Lara's breath caught. He was gone. But something felt wrong. The warehouse was still too silent. The shadows stretched too long. She wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was him, the driver. His face was now visible, but it wasn't the man she had seen earlier. This was someone else entirely. Someone she had never seen before. He smiled at her, his eyes cold. "You made your choice," he said. "But you still don't understand, do you? This isn't over." Lara's mind spun. How many of them were there? And what were they planning? But she couldn't stop now. She had to keep fighting. She couldn't let them win. Not when the truth was so close. Not when it was all about to unravel. Lara gripped the pipe tighter, and as the shadows closed in, she made a silent vow. She would find a way to expose the system. She would make sure Ashford and his network paid for what they had done. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Lara stood over the motionless body of Ashford, the dim light from her phone casting long, twisted shadows across the cold concrete floor. The silence that enveloped the warehouse felt suffocating, almost unnatural. The faint hum of broken monitors was the only sound left, the buzz of static filling the gaps where once there had been secrets, manipulation, and lies. "Get down," he yelled, pushing her toward the ground as the door burst open. Lara scrambled to react, but it was too late. A dark figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the light. A single shot rang out. Lara's world went black. The last thing she heard was Harris's voice, weak and distant. "Get out, while you still can." Then everything went silent. The darkness consumed her like a thick fog, pulling her deeper into nothingness. Lara's senses faded, one by one, and she felt herself slipping into an abyss. Her body was heavy, unmoving. Her thoughts felt distant, as if she were floating just outside her own mind. But then, a sharp pain pierced through the fog. Her head. A dull throb that brought her back, just enough for her to realize where she was. She blinked, struggling to focus. She was lying on the floor, the air around her thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Her chest heaved as she tried to move, but her limbs felt weak, unresponsive. The world around her seemed to spin. Slowly, her vision cleared. She could make out the shape of Harris slumped against the far wall, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes were wide, glazed, but there was no sign of life left in them. Lara's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline forcing her to push through the haze. She had to move. She had to survive. The silence in the room felt suffocating now. The gunshot had been close enough to rattle the walls, but there was no sound now. No footsteps. No more movement. Just a cold, eerie stillness. Lara's hand instinctively reached for her gun, but her holster was empty. She forced herself to sit up, her vision swimming. The office door was wide open, the hallway beyond dark and desolate. Who had shot Harris? Who had done this to them? Lara's instincts kicked in. She had to get out of there. Her body protested with every movement, but she pushed herself to her feet, using the edge of the desk for support. Each step was a struggle, but she refused to collapse. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. She stumbled down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. Her heart was in her throat, the air thick with tension. As she reached the stairwell, she paused. Should she call for backup? No. She couldn't risk it. Not with the people behind this, whoever they were, still lurking in the shadows. She had to find out who was pulling the strings. And she had to do it alone. Lara moved with purpose, though every step felt like it could be her last. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to connect the dots. Ashford was just the beginning, she knew that now. But who was really in charge? Who were the people controlling him and controlling the city? As she made her way to the parking garage, a thought struck her. The files. The ones Harris had shown her. They had names, connections. But who else had access to them? Who else could have planted them there? Lara's breath quickened. Was there anyone she could trust anymore? The garage was empty when she reached it, the dim lights flickering overhead. Her car was parked in the far corner, just where she had left it. But something felt off. The air smelled different, darker, more oppressive. Lara's hand hovered over the keys as she approached the car. Something wasn't right. The moment she opened the door, she froze. The faint, unmistakable scent of gasoline filled the air. Her heart skipped. She slammed the door shut and stepped back, her eyes scanning the surroundings. There was no one. But her instincts told her this wasn't random. Someone had been waiting for her. Lara quickly stepped back toward the stairwell, her mind racing with every possibility. She needed to think fast. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard a noise behind her, a car engine, distant but unmistakable. Someone was coming. Lara darted to the side, ducking behind a pillar just as a black sedan rolled into the parking lot. She held her breath, her body pressed into the cold concrete. The car came to a stop near her own, its headlights blinding for a moment before they flicked off. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, wearing a dark coat. Lara's pulse quickened. Was it them? The people behind all this? The figure didn't look around, didn't seem to notice her. He walked briskly toward the far end of the garage. Lara's eyes narrowed. She needed to follow him. She had no choice. This was the lead she had been waiting for. But as she moved forward, a voice stopped her cold. Lara. She froze, her blood running cold. It wasn't the man from the sedan. It was another voice, this one familiar. She turned slowly. And there, standing in the shadows near the stairwell, was someone she never expected to see. Detective Harris. Or at least, someone who looked like him. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, but his eyes were unmistakable. The same cold, calculating gaze she had seen before. But this was wrong. Harris was dead. He was supposed to be dead. And yet, here he was. A twisted smile spread across his lips. You didn't think they'd let you walk away, did you? He said softly, the words laced with a cruel edge. Lara's heart dropped. Everything she had known was shattering around her. Who was standing before her? And what had happened to the real Harris? Lara's breath caught in her throat. The man in front of her looked like Harris. He had the same face, the same voice, the same unsettling calm. But Lara knew, deep down, that this was not him. The real Harris was dead. She had seen it with her own eyes. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she took a cautious step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. But there was no gun. Her holster was empty. The man's smile deepened, as if he could read her mind. You're not armed, Lara, he said, his voice smooth and mocking. And you're alone. Do you really think you can survive what's coming? Lara's throat tightened. Who was this? What was this? Who are you? She demanded, her voice hoarse but firm. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You can call me Harris. For now, he said, his lips curling into a grin that sent a chill through her bones. Her mind raced. What was going on? Was this some kind of trick? A twisted mind game? She couldn't afford to be distracted. She needed answers, and fast. I know what you're thinking, the imposter continued, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with something dark and predatory. You think this is all just coincidence. You think it's all just a series of isolated events. But it's not, Lara. None of it is. The words hung heavy in the air, each one like a knife slowly twisting into her chest. Lara stepped back again, her heart racing in her chest. What was he talking about? He continued, his tone almost conversational, as if he were explaining something obvious. You see, Lara, you're not the only one who's been chasing shadows. The truth has always been in front of you. But you were too busy looking at the wrong people, the wrong faces. Ashford, Sarah, even me. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on hers, burning with intensity. I was never Harris, he said, his smile widening. Not really. Harris was just a name. A mask, like the others. I've been in your life for longer than you realize. Watching you. Waiting for the right moment. Lara's breath caught. Her mind was spinning. How could this be possible? She had known Harris for years. He had been her mentor, a trusted ally. And yet now, this man, this thing, was claiming to have been him all along. Why, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why all of this? Why me? The imposter paused, his grin fading into something darker. Because you're the key, he said, his voice low, almost reverent. You were always meant to find the truth. But you're not ready for it yet. You still don't see the full picture. Lara's stomach twisted with dread. What was he saying? What truth? I'll make sure you understand soon enough, the imposter continued, his eyes narrowing. But for now, you need to make a choice. Lara's pulse quickened. A choice? What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice rising. The imposter smiled again, a cold, calculating smile that made her skin crawl. The truth, Lara. The truth has a price. And you can either pay it, or walk away. But if you choose to walk away, you'll never be the same again. You'll never see the world the way you do now. And when you finally figure it out, it'll be too late. Lara's mind was racing. The pieces were scattered all around her, and she couldn't make sense of them. She had been chasing this case for so long, but now it felt like the whole world was unraveling before her eyes. Everything she had believed in was a lie. Choose wisely, the imposter added, his voice now laced with a strange kind of finality. You've been part of something bigger than you realize, Lara. And soon, you'll understand what that really means. Lara's heart pounded in her chest. Was he threatening her? Or was he offering her something she couldn't yet comprehend? Before she could respond, the sound of a car engine revving echoed through the parking garage, slicing through the tense silence like a knife. Lara's head snapped toward the noise. The sedan. It was still there, parked just a few feet away. The imposter followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. Your ride is waiting, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Go ahead, Lara. You've been following the wrong path for so long. But maybe it's time for a new one. Lara's mind screamed at her to run, to get away, to escape whatever twisted game this was. But something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke, held her frozen. There was something else here. Something more than just a threat. It was a challenge. A test. And Lara knew, deep down, that she couldn't walk away now. She had come too far. But she also knew that if she stepped toward that car, if she followed wherever this path led, she might never come back. The imposter's smile widened, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. The decision was hers. And whatever choice she made, it would change everything. Lara's breath was shallow, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She stood there, torn between two paths, two futures. One led into the unknown, the other into the crushing certainty of everything she had just discovered. Her eyes darted from the imposter, Harris, or whatever he was, to the sedan in the distance, its engine growling like a beast ready to pounce. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though every moment stretched out longer than it should have. She could almost hear the ticking of an invisible clock, counting down the seconds until her choice was forced upon her. "Make it quick, Lara," the imposter said, his voice like ice, cutting through the tension. "You don't have forever." She closed her eyes, feeling the adrenaline surge through her veins, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. Everything inside her screamed for escape. The imposter wasn't Harris. He couldn't be. But he looked like him, and his words, his presence, were too familiar, too calculated. It was as if he had studied her every move, every decision, and now, he was playing her like a pawn on a chessboard. Lara's eyes flicked to the sedan again, its headlights cutting through the dim garage like beacons of a fate she couldn't avoid. Her mind reeled. Who was really behind this? Who had orchestrated this entire nightmare? The imposter's grin stretched wider, his eyes gleaming with malicious glee. "You can't run from this. Not now. Not anymore." But Lara didn't run. She couldn't. Not without answers. Her eyes hardened, a fierce resolve settling into her bones. She couldn't trust this thing in front of her. But she also couldn't let fear dictate her every move. "You've made your choice already," the imposter said, his voice colder now. "You just don't know it yet." Lara gritted her teeth, her mind snapping into focus. She needed to find out who was behind everything. She couldn't let this, whatever this was continue. She looked at the imposter one last time. "If you're so sure of your victory," she said, her voice low, "then why are you still standing here?" The imposter's smile faltered for a brief second, then came back stronger, sharper. "You think you have time, Lara? You think you have a chance?" But his words no longer had any weight. Lara turned away, heading for the sedan. Each step felt like she was walking deeper into a trap, but it didn't matter. She wasn't running anymore. As she neared the car, the door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the driver, a tall figure, cloaked in shadows, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Lara paused. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty gripped her, but she didn't turn back. "Get in," the figure said in a voice that was strangely familiar, but cold. Lara's instincts screamed at her to turn around, to take another path, but she stepped inside the car. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the garage like a final, irrevocable decision. The engine roared to life, and they sped out of the parking garage, the world outside blurring into streaks of light and shadow. The man in the driver's seat didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lara could feel it. This was it. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. The car sped through the city, the buildings around them unfamiliar, alien. They didn't take the usual route. This was something else. Lara stared ahead, her mind spinning. Who was this driver? Who was behind everything? The imposter's face flashed in her mind. She knew she had made the right choice. But the truth was still out of reach. The car slowed, and for the first time, Lara felt the unsettling stillness of the world around her. The car turned onto a narrow street, the buildings closing in, until they reached a secluded warehouse at the end. The driver stopped the car and cut the engine. "Out," he said, his voice clipped. Lara stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. The warehouse loomed before her, dark and silent. The man stayed behind the wheel, his face still obscured by the shadows. Without a word, Lara walked toward the entrance, her eyes scanning the surroundings. As she stepped inside the warehouse, a sudden weight pressed down on her chest. This was no ordinary warehouse. There was something off about it. Everything felt wrong. The door creaked shut behind her, plunging her into complete darkness. And then, a voice, familiar yet distant, echoed through the silence. "Welcome, Lara." Her blood ran cold. It was Ashford. Lara's body froze, but she didn't speak. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that, in this moment, she was no longer just a detective. She had become something else, something darker, something desperate. She wasn't sure who she was fighting for anymore, or even if there was anyone left to save. The man on the floor, the twisted version of Ashford, was the last thread she had clung to, the last remnant of the nightmare she had fallen into. And now, with his blood pooling around him, she knew the nightmare wasn't over. It had only evolved. A soft creak echoed behind her. Lara's instincts snapped to attention. Her fingers tightened around the metal pipe in her hand, the cold weight grounding her in the present. She slowly turned, eyes narrowing, ready for whatever came next. And there, standing in the shadows, was the driver, the one who had brought her here. His silhouette was tall, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, but the eerie calmness in his stance told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just some random player in the game. He was part of it. You think killing him will end this? The man's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried an unmistakable threat. You think this was the final move? It's only just begun, Lara. Lara's breath caught in her throat. She had no answers, no more puzzles to solve. Only the grim certainty that this was far from over. I know who you are, Lara said, her voice steadied despite the storm of thoughts crashing through her mind. I know what you've done. The man stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. His face finally came into view, a face she didn't recognize, but one that seemed eerily familiar. The same cold eyes. The same calculating stare that seemed to pierce straight through her. You think you understand the game? He asked, his lips curling into a smile that sent a chill through her. You've been a player all along, Lara. You just didn't know it. All those years of chasing ghosts, chasing shadows, and now, you see it. But it's too late. Lara's mind reeled, 1,000 pieces of the puzzle falling into place, only to scatter again, out of reach. He was right. Everything had led her here. Every death, every twisted turn of fate. She had never been in control, had never truly understood the scope of what was happening. But she would understand, she vowed. She had to. The man took another step closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. You wanted the truth. You wanted to know who's really behind all of this. But now you'll have to choose, continue to dig deeper, to expose everything, or leave it alone and walk away. The choice is yours. But know this, if you keep going, if you don't stop, there will be no turning back. You'll be part of this, forever. Lara's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She could feel the pull, the temptation to walk away, to put it all behind her. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Not after everything. Not after the lives that had been lost, after everything that had been hidden in plain sight. The choice was clear. No, she whispered, a final spark of defiance igniting within her. I'm not walking away. The man's smile faded, his eyes darkening with something darker, something colder. He stepped back into the shadows. So be it, he said, his voice cold as ice. But remember, Lara, the truth always comes with a price. And you may not like the cost when you finally see it. Lara stood alone in the warehouse, the body of Ashford lying cold at her feet, the flashing lights of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she knew what came next. She would keep fighting. She would tear down everything. Every last lie. Every last shadow. She would expose it all. The cost didn't matter anymore. Because, in the end, the truth was worth any price. And so, with a final breath, Lara turned, ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer a victim of this twisted game. She was the one who would end it. And it was just beginning.